the MiG-15. It is known as a symbol of Soviet power, born behind the Iron Curtain. But what if this entire legend is just a facade, hiding the most audacious technological heist in history? This is the story of how Great Britain, in a fit of naivety or greed, sold its main adversary its own future sword. Of how German aerodynamic blueprints, the ghosts of a fallen Reich, showed that sword the path to the sky, and of how Soviet engineers achieved the impossible, turning a stolen masterpiece into a weapon that shocked the entire world. We will dismantle this mechanical chimera down to the last screw to understand what truly gives birth to superiority, the spark of one's own genius, or the ruthless will to turn a foreign secret into your own legend. 1946. The world stood still, exhaling after the most terrible war in history. But in the quiet of offices and the hum of factories, a new conflict was already being born. Cold, technological. And in this new war, the victor on the ground, the Soviet Union, was desperately losing the race in the sky. German engineers, taken from the defeated Reich, were already working in Soviet factories, sharing the secrets of jet engine construction. But their technology was yesterday's news. The captured engines were temperamental, unreliable, with a pathetic lifespan of just a few dozen hours. It was a dead end. Meanwhile, in the West, a new generation of engines was already roaring to life. Powerful, perfect. The problem had a specific name, the Rolls-Royce Nene, a British engineering marvel, the heart that Soviet aviation lacked, and so a delegation was sent to London in pursuit of this heart. At its head was not an official, not a diplomat, but Artem Mikoyan himself, one of the country's best aircraft designers. This was not just a business trip. It was a hunt. The British received them, showed them everything, and more. They weren't just boasting about their achievement. They were willing to sell it, to sell a potential enemy the technology that would define military superiority for decades to come. Why? This question still has no clear answer. Was Sir Stafford Cripps, the Minister of Trade, a naive idealist who believed in post-war friendship? Or a cold pragmatist who urgently needed to refill the treasury of a war-torn Britain? Perhaps both. Or maybe they simply didn't believe that those Russians could copy such a complex mechanism. News of the British willingness to make a deal reached the Kremlin. The Minister of Aviation Industry, Khrushchev, reporting to Stalin, couldn't hide his astonishment. He asked the only question that seemed logical. Why would they sell their secrets? A pause followed, and then, with a smirk no one would dare call kind, Stalin uttered a phrase that became prophetic. What fool would sell his own secrets? The deal was done. April 1947. The first shipment arrives in the Soviet Union. 10 brand new Rolls-Royce Nene engines. They were not met as merchandise. They were met as a trophy. In Vladimir Klimov's design bureau, an almost surgical silence reigned. The precious Nene was disassembled down to the last screw, studied, measured, copied, ruthlessly and brilliantly. And it was then, on one of the turbine blades, that the Soviet engineers discovered a small, elegant engraving. 3 words, full of British pride and, as it turned out, fatal short-sightedness. Made in England. It is said that Klimov, after inspecting it, gave a short order. On the Soviet copy, the RD-45 engine, this inscription must be reproduced exactly, as a mark of quality, as bitter irony. The British heart was ready to beat in a Soviet chest, and soon the whole world would hear its fearsome roar. The British heart was ready. But a heart alone is not enough to fly. It needs a body, wings, a soul, and Soviet jet fighters of that time were clumsy, straight-winged machines, essentially piston engine airframes into which a new, roaring organ had been crudely implanted. The power of the Nene engine would have simply ripped the wings off them. A breakthrough was needed, and that breakthrough was found in dusty folders marked Secret. On the designer's desks lay stacks of captured documents, the aerodynamic calculations of Third Reich engineers, their dreams of the future that never had the chance to be realized in metal, and among them, the Focke-Wulf Ta 183 project, a sleek, predatory fighter with wings swept back like a hawk's, a German blueprint, a ghost from the ashes of a fallen empire, was pointing the way. On March 11, 1947, a decree from the Council of Ministers was issued. The dry, official language of the document concealed the start of a merciless race. The country's two main design bureaus, OKB 155 of Mikoyan and Gurevich and OKB 301 of Semyon Lavochkin, were ordered to create a fighter based on the British engine. This was not a competition. It was a duel of minds, where the loser could lose everything. At the Mikoyan Design Bureau, the project was given the code I-310. The engineers worked in 3 shifts. They were creating a mechanical chimera, a British engine, a German aerodynamic concept, and Soviet engineering thought, tasked with fusing it all into a single entity. A 35-degree wing sweep, a high T-tail. Every line on the blueprint was a step into the unknown. Meanwhile, Vladimir Klimov and his team performed their own miracle. They didn't just copy the Nene, they made it speak Russian. The Soviet copy, the RD-45 engine, was ready. Time was measured in months, not years. Stalin was waiting. December 30th, 1947. A frosty gray day. On the airfield in Zhukovsky stood the prototype I-310. Silver, with a predatory curve to its wings, it looked like a visitor from the future. In the cockpit was test pilot Viktor Yuganov. The fate of the entire project rested on his shoulders. In a moment, this fusion of British, German, and Russian engineering would either fly or remain forever on the ground as a pile of expensive metal. The engine roared. An unfamiliar sharp sound pierced the frosty air. The I-310 shot forward, rapidly gaining speed. And then it lifted off the ground, effortlessly, confidently, as if it had been born for this sky. The flight lasted only 17 minutes. 17 minutes that decided everything. Yuganov's report was brief. The machine is stable, responsive, the rate of climb, incredible. Lavochkin's competitor would not take to the air for another 5 months. Too late. The race was won. On that snowy airfield, a legend was born. The I-310 project received a new, dry military designation, one destined to thunder across the world. MiG-15. The prototype I-310, born in a design duel, died. It died to be reborn by the thousands. Its name was now MiG-15. Dry, military, like a gunshot. At Factory No. 1 in Kuibyshev, the assembly line turned blueprints into steel arrows. This was no longer the custom work of geniuses, but a relentless industrial flow. The country was forging its celestial shield, and on July 10, 1949, they decided to show this shield to the world. The Tushino Air Parade. Over the heads of a stunned audience and foreign attachés, accustomed to the drone of piston engines, a formation of 9 silver predators streaked by. Their piercing whistle was the sound of a new era. This wasn't just a plane. It was a political statement. A demonstration that the copied British heart was not just beating. It was eager for battle. But Soviet engineers were not about to stop there. In the same Klimov OKB, where they had just reproduced a foreign masterpiece with surgical precision, work was already underway to improve it. The RD-45 engine was good. But its upgraded version, the VK-1, became a true beast. Thrust increased by almost 20%. A new version of the fighter, the MiG-15BIs, with this new, more powerful heart, could climb to a staggering 15.5 kilometers and soar upwards at a rate of 50 meters per second. This was no longer just a copy. This was an heir that had surpassed its ancestor. June 1950. A distant, dusty Korea, a peninsula divided by ideology, exploded into war. For the U.S. Air Force, which dominated the skies, it initially seemed like just another local operation. Their F-80 shooting starfighters, veteran, reliable, straight-winged machines, ruled the altitudes. They hunted trains, strafed columns, bombed bridges. Everything changed in a single day. Under a cloak of the strictest secrecy, the 64th Fighter Aviation Corps was deployed to China. Soviet aces, heroes of the Great Patriotic War, officially became Chinese volunteers. Their task was to protect the strategic bridges over the Yalu River, the artery through which supplies flowed to the North Korean forces. November 1st, 1950. Lieutenant Fyodor Chizh led his group of MiGs on their first combat sortie. American pilots in their F-80s saw unfamiliar silhouettes in the sky. Swept-winged, predatory, they were unlike anything they had ever encountered. And they moved wrong. With incredible speed, they would pull up into a vertical climb, a maneuver the shooting stars simply could not follow. It was a shock, a cold, unpleasant blow to the very heart of American air superiority. In the reports flying back to Tokyo and the Pentagon, a new, terrifying word began to appear: MiG. The Korean surprise, as it would later be called, was not just a nuisance. It was a catastrophe. The entire air war strategy was collapsing. The B-29 Superfortress bombers, which had seemed invincible just yesterday, were suddenly transformed into slow-moving targets for these red comets. America urgently needed an answer, and they had only one. A plane whose fate, like the MiGs, was tied to captured German blueprints. A fighter built for a duel of equals. The order was given. Across the Pacific, on the decks of aircraft carriers, a worthy opponent was already sailing to Korea. Its name was the F-86 Sabre. In the skies over the Yalu River, the most famous air battle of the jet age was about to begin. And so they met. The sky over the Yalu River became the first gladiatorial arena of the jet age, a place that American pilots would name with a mix of fear and respect: MiG Alley. Here, at an altitude of 10 kilometers, two technological marvels clashed. Two cousins born from the same German genius and raised on opposite sides of the Iron Curtain. It was a duel of two philosophies, two schools of air combat. The MiG-15 was a heavyweight boxer. Its main weapon was the vertical. Thanks to its incredible rate of climb, this engineering hybrid could reach its service ceiling of 15 kilometers in minutes, becoming unreachable for the Sabre. From there, the Soviet pilots, many of whom had survived the meat grinder of the Great Patriotic War, practiced their favorite tactic: hit and run. A dive on the target, a burst of fire, and then back up into the safety of the blue, where they had absolute advantage. The F-86 Sabre was a fencer. It was inferior in climb rate and altitude, but faster in a dive and more agile on the horizontal. Its main advantage was its gun sight. A radar-ranging sight in the Sabre's nose allowed the pilot to know the exact distance to the target, making its gunfire far more effective. But the main difference was in their armament, in the very logic of destruction. The Americans bet on a high volume of fire. 6 heavy-caliber Browning machine guns spat out a wall of lead. To shoot down a MiG, you had to riddle it with bullets, turn it into a sieve. The Soviet approach was different, radical, It was designed not to hunt fighters, but giants, the flying fortresses. The MiG's nose housed a monstrous cannon battery, two 23mm cannons and one 37mm. The latter was a true hammer of the gods. Its 700-gram high-explosive shell didn't just damage, it annihilated. A single hit was enough to tear a wing off a Sabre or blow its engine to pieces. But this hammer had its price: a low rate of fire and completely different ballistics. To hit with all three barrels at once was an art reserved for the aces, and the aces were not long in coming. In the cockpits of the MiGs sat men like Yevgeny Pepelyayev and Nikolai Sutyagin, men for whom war was a profession. On the radio, they spoke Chinese using special phrasebooks, but in the heat of battle, they often broke into their native Russian profanity, to the complete bewilderment of American radio intercept operators. They were opposed by predators of their own kind: James Jabara, the first American jet ace, and hundreds of other pilots ready to fight for every foot of altitude. The duel of technology became a duel of nerves, a deadly game of cat and mouse at the speed of sound. But the true moment of truth was yet to come, a day that would forever be etched in the history of the USAF under a grim name. April 12, 1951. Black Thursday. An armada was approaching the Yalu River bridges, 36 B-29 bombers escorted by nearly 100 fighters. The superfortresses, which had incinerated Tokyo, seemed an invincible force, but they were expected. 44 MiG-15s under the command of Ivan Kozhedub, the legendary W.P.U. ace whom Stalin had personally forbidden from flying combat missions, took to the air. They ignored the fighter escort. Their targets were the slow-moving giants. Using their main advantage, the MiGs climbed higher than everyone, and as the B-29s approached the target, a deadly waterfall rained down on them from the sky. It wasn't a battle, it was a slaughter. The 37mm shells tore duralumin to shreds. 10 superfortresses and several fighters fell to the earth in fiery comets. Another dozen damaged planes barely made it back to their bases, never to fly again. The Americans did not shoot down a single MiG. The shock in the Pentagon was comparable to Pearl Harbor. On that day, the supremacy of American strategic aviation ended. An order was given to cease daylight B-29 raids deep into MiG Alley. The celestial shield forged in Kuibyshev had proven to be impenetrable. The duel continued, but now the rules had changed. A fragile, bloody stalemate was established in the skies over Korea. No one could gain the upper hand. It was a deadlock, drawn in the sky by the contrails of the two greatest fighters of their era. Technology had created a challenge, and technology had provided the answer. The war had entered a new, frightening phase. The bloody stalemate over MiG Alley was not just a military deadlock. It was an intellectual challenge. After Black Thursday, the fear of B-29 armadas was replaced by a fear of the unknown. What was this machine? What could it really do? The wreckage of downed planes provided only partial answers. American intelligence didn't need a corpse. They needed a living specimen, the holy grail of the Cold War. But how do you catch a ghost? How do you make the enemy give up his greatest secret voluntarily? The war mutated. From an altitude of 10 kilometers, it moved into the quiet offices of psychologists and Air Force strategists. Instead of bombs, they decided to use the most powerful weapon of all, human desire. Thus was born Operation Moolah. The idea was outrageously bold. Instead of shooting down pilots, they would offer them a deal: 100,000 American dollars, a fortune by 1953 standards, and political asylum in the United States. for the first person to deliver an intact MiG-15 to a South Korean airfield. The skies rained not with bombs, but with promises. Millions of leaflets fell on airfields in China and North Korea, turning every fighter jet into a lottery ticket for a new life. Months passed. The operation seemed to be a failure. Silence. Not a single defector. The Pentagon was ready to file the idea away as a useless curiosity, but the seed of temptation, dropped from the heavens, had already taken root in the soul of one man. September 21st, 1953. The war was almost over. The armistice had been signed. A lone blip appeared on the radar at Kimpo Air Base. It was flying from the north. It was a MiG. American Sabres immediately scrambled to intercept. But something strange was happening. The ghost plane wasn't attacking. It was rocking its wings, the international sign of peaceful intentions, and it was lowering its landing gear. On the ground, bewilderment turned to shock. The silver predator that had terrorized their bombers for 2 years gently touched down and rolled straight towards the control tower. A young pilot climbed out of the cockpit. Senior Lieutenant No Kum-sok of the North Korean Air Force. He knew nothing about any $100,000. He just wanted to escape the war and the regime. Operation Moolah had worked by accident, but the result exceeded all expectations. The ghost of MiG Alley was caught. Now it was time to open its skull. The plane, given the U.S. serial number 616, became the most studied object on the planet. It was taken apart down to the last screw, and the man whose name was synonymous with speed took the controls. Chuck Yeager, the first pilot to break the sound barrier. It was he and the other test pilots who delivered the final verdict. Yes, the engineering marvel's rate of climb was phenomenal. Yes, its cannon battery could tear planes to shreds. But now, its fatal flaws were also visible. The gun sight was primitive. No radar ranging like on the Sabre. Hitting a target with 3 cannons of different ballistics was a true art, requiring an almost intuitive feel from the pilot. The cockpit was cramped, and the pilot had no G-suit, which severely limited his abilities in a turning fight. But the main, deadly flaw was hidden at extreme speeds. As it approached the speed of sound, the MiG became uncontrollable. It had a dangerous tendency to pitch up on its own, sending it into an unrecoverable dive. For Yeager and his colleagues, this was a revelation. They now knew their enemy's Achilles heel. To defeat a MiG, you had to drag it into a dive, force it to chase a Sabre downwards, into a realm where the Soviet fighter became its own worst enemy. The secret that had cost hundreds of lives was revealed. The war in the skies of Korea was over, but its main lesson had been learned. Technological superiority is not just what you have, but what you know about your opponent. The ghost had been caught, and now the Americans knew how to hunt it. The cannons over Korea fell silent. The bloody stalemate established in the sky over the Yalu River froze into a fragile truce. For many, this was the end of the story. But for the MiG-15, it was merely a change of roles. The duelist became a diplomat, the killer, a commodity. The ghost of MiG Alley was preparing for a world tour. Now that its main secret had been revealed by the Americans, now that Chuck Yeager had studied every flaw in its design, it might have seemed that the story was over, that the veteran had fought its last war. But the Kremlin thought otherwise. Instead of sending this engineering masterpiece into retirement, the Soviet Union floored the accelerator. All the way. 18,000. Think about that number. 18,000 machines. That's not just a lot. It is the most mass-produced jet armada in human history. After Korea, production didn't slow down. It exploded. The assembly lines ran not only in Kuibyshev. The blueprints, like secret dispatches, flew to the countries of the new socialist commonwealth. In Czechoslovakia, at the Aero Vodochody factory, it was reborn as the S-102. In Poland, at the famous PZL Mielec, it was called the Lim-1. The names changed, but the essence remained the same: the steel fist of Moscow. And this fist began to spread across the world, painting the map in new colors. 42 countries, from the icy airfields of East Germany to the sun-scorched bases in Egypt and Syria, from the jungles of Vietnam to the islands of Indonesia. Wherever the Kremlin's ambitions reached, the familiar silver silhouette with the swept-back wing was the first to appear. This was not just a weapon. This was politics cast in duralumin. Every MiG-15 given to an ally was a silent message to Washington, a symbol of loyalty, a guarantee of protection. It became the main export of Soviet influence. The aerial ambassador of the Cold War, speaking the universal language of speed and fire. In its two-seat trainer version, nicknamed Midget in the West, entire generations of pilots from Warsaw to Beijing first felt the power of jet propulsion, first saw the curvature of the Earth from an altitude of 15 kilometers. This engineering masterpiece, born from a British heart and tempered in the skies of Korea, had now become the universal soldier of the global confrontation. The ambassador had delivered its message, and very soon, in the sands of the Sinai and the jungles of Indochina, it would have to back up its diplomatic arguments with fire. Time strips the war paint from metal, leaving only the memory of past glory. The fearsome ghost of MiG Alley, the killer of bombers, gradually yielded the sky to its younger, more advanced brothers. But the story of this engineering masterpiece did not end in a scrapyard. It simply changed professions. Its immortality had a name: the UTI MiG-15, NATO reporting name, Midget. In Russia, it was called more simply and warmly, the Spark, a two-seat trainer aircraft, a machine stripped of its deadly cannons, but which retained the most important thing: its flight character, its soul. It was this humble workhorse that outlived its combat sibling by decades. While first-generation fighters were becoming museum exhibits, the Spark kept working. It became a flying school desk, a cradle for hundreds of thousands of fledgling pilots around the world. If the combat MiG-15 was the steel fist of Moscow, then its trainer version was its schoolteacher. For decades, this gray-haired veteran took new generations of pilots into the sky, from the Arctic Circle to the African deserts. Its simple and reliable design forgave novice mistakes, while its phenomenal rate of climb showed them for the first time the true power of the jet age. In some countries, this machine remained in service well into the 21st century, a living legend that refused to retire. But this long, venerable service came at a price, and a finale, written not by a design bureau, but by fate itself. A finale that forever linked the aircraft that opened one era with the man who opened another. It was a routine training flight, one of thousands made by this Spark. At the controls were two men, an experienced instructor, Colonel Vladimir Seryogin, and a pilot who needed to refresh his flying skills after a long break. This pilot was known to the entire world. His name was Yuri Gagarin. The man who was the first to see our planet from space sat in the cramped cockpit of a machine born 20 years before his triumph. He was returning to his first love, the sky, the airplanes, and the old, faithful Spark was supposed to help him. They took off at 10:19 a.m., and at 10:30, his voice on the radio uttered the last phrase: "Mission in the zone complete. Commencing turn." And then, silence. Thus, the story ended. The plane that opened the jet age for the Soviet Union became the last plane for the man who opened the space age for all of humanity. Their fates intertwined at a single fiery point, a single jagged wound on the body of the spring sky. The causes of that crash are still the subject of debate, theories, and rumors. But one fact is undeniable. The legend of the sky took the legend of space with it, as if the old veteran, having completed his last, most tragic mission, retired, taking his most famous student with him, putting a bloody end to his own biography and to an entire era of great hopes. The story of the MiG-15 is not the story of a machine. It is a parable of how genius born in one country can be stolen, copied, and perfected in another, becoming a mirror of an entire era, an era of great ambitions and deadly confrontation. From the bitter irony of the Made in England engraving on a Soviet turbine to the tragic finale in the skies over Chkalovsky, this aircraft didn't just fly, it wrote history. What is the true engine of progress? A spark of brilliant insight, or the ruthless will of a system ready to do anything for superiority? And what price do we ultimately pay for breakthroughs born in the crucible of fear and enmity? This story has no simple answers, which is why we would be glad to hear your opinion. Share your thoughts in the comments. Your feedback is the best reward for our work. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories that make you think.